Okay. Thank you everyone for coming to Josh's presentation on community solar. So some of you may know Josh, but he has been our energy equity intern at BCRC for the past like 6 weeks, I'd say. He's a rising junior at Williams College and has been doing some really excellent research on low income barriers to general energy like weatherization efficiency, but also with a specific, focus and interest in community solar, and has done some really great research and had a lot of great conversations with folks about the solar landscape, and is going to be sharing his presentation with you. And we should have some time for questions at the end. So I'll turn things over to Josh.
Perfect. Thank you, Callie. Let me just share my screen really quickly. Okay. You can all see that, right? Okay, cool. So good afternoon, everyone. Like Callie said, my name is Josh Kirschner, and I'm a rising junior at Williams College. And this summer, I was the energy equity intern here at the Bennington County Regional Commission. And today, I'm going to be talking about addressing barriers to low-income access to residential solar here in Bennington County. So to start off with a little bit, I just want to talk about Vermont's energy goals. So Vermont is considered a national leader in energy and climate policy. According to the 2022 Comprehensive Energy Plan, the state is expecting to meet 90% of its energy demand using renewable energy by 2050. And it's also looking to dramatically lower its emissions by 2050. Here in Bennington County, our goals are also pretty ambitious. By 2050, we're looking to expand the usage of electricity by 50% using renewable energy. And more specifically, we're looking to add 85 new megawatts of solar capacity by 2050. So when we're talking about the energy transition here in Vermont, we need to talk about costs. Vermont residents experience some of the highest energy costs in the country. Using data from the 2020 census, we can calculate that the average Vermonter spends about $2,900 every year on energy, and that's a value that ranges dramatically from year to year and across income barriers. And here in Bennington County, the cost is actually about $50 to $100 more expensive. And so to truly gauge how these costs affect residents, we can use a metric known as energy burden. And so what energy burden is, it is a percentage of it's energy spending as a percentage of total income. And so it shows us how much of a strain energy spending is on a household's financial stability. So again, using data from the census, we can calculate that the average Vermonter has an energy burden of about 10%. And here in Bennington County, it's actually a bit higher. It's closer to 12%, which is pretty significant. And it's also interesting to note that across the towns here in Bennington County, that varies dramatically. Using data from Efficiency Vermont, we know that Landgrove and Peru have some of the lowest energy burdens in the county, while Bennington, the town itself, has the highest energy burden in the county. So again, when we're talking about energy burden, it's important to recognize that this burden is not shared equally across income quintiles. If we break up all of the residents in Bennington County into 5 different income quintiles, we can see that people have the bottom 20% of income earners in the county have a lot smaller energy costs, but significantly higher energy burden. As we can see here, although the bottom 20% spends about 25% less every year on energy than the top 20% of earners, they spend about 8 times more of their income comparatively to that top 20%. And since we're going to be talking about solar energy today, I also wanted to mention electricity burden. And so electricity burden is just a subset of energy burden. And so we see a very similar pattern emerge here, although the bottom 20% spends about 30% less on electricity every year. They spend almost 8 times more than the top 20%. So moving on, so why are we talking about solar energy today? So there are a couple of reasons. So first of all, solar energy it will be a major player in the state energy transition. As Vermont moves away from fossil fuels, it's expected that solar energy is going to take up a large bulk of the load. Currently in state, we have about 450 megawatts of solar capacity, and that's expected to rise to 600 megawatts by 2030. And just for some context about how big that is, the Vermont Yankee Nuclear Power Plant, before it closed in 2014, had a capacity of 620 megawatts and accounted for 71% of in-state generation. And so this just shows that as solar energy scales up, it's going to take up a large portion of in-state generation. Here in Bennington County, we're again expected to see a large deployment of solar energy. When we wrote our comprehensive energy plan in 2017, there was about 10 megawatts of capacity in the county. Today, we sit somewhere between 20 and 30 megawatts, although the data on that is kind of unclear, as I'll go to later. And as I mentioned earlier, we're expecting to, our goal is to reach about 85 megawatts by 2050, although that might range between 68 and 107 megawatts. So beyond how it's important in the energy transition, solar energy also has really good economic and financial benefits. Solar energy can be used to lower electricity costs. Here in Bennington County, the average annual electricity cost is $1,274. And so by deploying solar energy, we can lower costs and thus lower energy burden for our residents. And so one of the reasons why solar energy is so economical and so financially beneficial is because of net metering. And so what net metering is, it's essentially a way for compensating panel owners for the electricity that they produce for the larger grid. So I'm sure as many of us know, during the day, a solar panel might be producing more energy than a household needs, in which case the excess electricity will be sent into the larger electric grid. And then at other points during the day, say nighttime, or if it's raining, or if it's just cloudy, the panels just might not be producing enough electricity to meet household demand, in which case that house is going to have to pull energy back from the grid. And so what net metering does is that it gives households credits for the electricity that it produces to the grid, which they can then use to offset how much they owe the utilities for the electricity they consume. So if I consume 5 kilowatt hours of energy from the electrical grid, but I produce 3 kilowatt hours of electricity through my solar panels, what net metering does, it allows me to essentially pay for just 2 kilowatt hours. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. This is just the current net metering rates as set by the Public Utilities Commission in their 2022 biennial update. As you can see, the top 2 rates are consistent across all categories. The one I do want to mention is the siting adjuster. The siting adjuster is the way for the Public Utilities Commission to essentially incentivize certain types of panels of certain sizes and placement over others. And so as you can see here, as the systems get larger and move away from preferred site, there is more taken off of the net metering rates, which then makes it less economical. And so as you can see here, the PUC is trying to incentivize small scale systems. So residential systems that are primarily less than 15 kilowatts rather than larger industrial size ones. So ones that are 150 to 500 kilowatt systems. There's some other incentives that we should talk about as well. One of them is the federal income tax credit. And so what this means is that panel owners are able to deduct 26% of the cost of the solar panels from their federal income tax the first year of the panel's operation. And so that rate has changed a lot recently. It might sunset by 2024, but as of right now, it's currently 26% of the cost. Here in Vermont, there's also state tax incentives as well. Panels that are under 50 kilowatts are exempt from state property tax valuation, and panels are also exempt from state sales tax altogether. And so there's some really great benefits to solar energy broadly. First of all, there's some great environmental benefits. Solar panels as a clean renewable alternative, they don't emit any greenhouse gases while they're producing electricity. And so by offsetting the need for fossil fuels and just the carbon emissions that are released from fossil fuels, we can thus lower our overall emissions by switching to solar panels. Excuse me. Yeah, and so that's the environmental one. And then moving on to, as I've been mentioning a lot, there's also some financial benefits. According to SolarSage, which is an online solar marketplace, here in Bennington County, over the 20-year lifetime of a solar panel owners can expect to see a savings of about $30,000 on average, which is a significant amount of savings over a 20-year period. It's also by offsetting utility costs and just generating savings, it can help to lower energy burden by over 50%. And also solar energy is a lot less volatile in terms of costs and prices as opposed to fossil fuels. As we've obviously been seeing recently, fossil fuel prices, so gas prices and oil prices can really change rapidly and dramatically, which can then really upend a household's finances or just budgeting. But solar energy is just a lot less volatile. The sun really isn't going anywhere. It's going to be here to produce energy for us for a long time. And so the cost associated with this is just a lot more stable over time. And finally, there's some really good health benefits associated with solar energy that's a bit downstream. Lower carbon emissions means less air pollution, and this can lead to lower rates of asthma and certain cancers, and just lower rates of illnesses, hospitalizations, and just premature deaths in the state. So moving on, so as I've been mentioning a lot, we're going to be seeing a rapid deployment of solar energy here in the state. But as we've been seeing currently, that deployment is not equal and consistent across income quintiles. According to data from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, we can see that there's actually great disparities in uptake across its income quintiles. Statewide, we can see that while the bottom 20% of households in the state own only 3% of solar capacity, the top 20% own 36% of capacity. Here in Bennington County, it's a bit better, but only marginally. The bottom 20% owns 5% of capacity, and the top 20% owns 30%. So again, as we're seeing, there's just massive disparities in who owns these panels. Before we move on, I also wanted to mention, I'm not going to talk about this the rest of the presentation. I just thought it was important to take note of that. In addition to disparities along income lines, there are also massive disparities along racial lines here in the state. People of color in Vermont are about 7 times less likely to own solar panels than their white residents. And so this is just something that I think deserves and should be explored further. So for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about some of the reasons why we're seeing such staggering uptake and why low-income residents are having trouble accessing solar energy. And so the most visible and obvious one is cost. Solar panels are just very expensive to buy, and they're very expensive investment. According to Solar Stage, here in Bennington County, the average cost is about $2.98 per watt. And so for a single kilowatt, you're looking at almost $3,000. And the site also estimates that for a 5 kilowatt system, the average market price, so including installation and maintenance fees, is just under $15,000, which is purely inaccessible for many residents in Bennington County, which includes the 11.6% of households who make less than $15,000 in a given year. And just because people make over $15,000, for many people in the county, that's just not a expenditure that they're willing to take on. It's also important to know that this is going to be an issue that we are going to continue to see in the future and might get worse. Because we're seeing material and operational costs rise for solar panels. As the US has faced inflation and supply chain issues, and as there's been new tariffs on solar panels recently, we're seeing that just material costs for panels will increase. And also just some changes in the regulatory sphere has made them more expensive, as I'll talk about later. One more thing to mention about costs also is the extensive payout period. So as I've been mentioning, solar panels, because of the savings that they create, will generate their own savings and pay themselves off eventually. But the time period that it takes for those panels to pay themselves off in Bennington County is about 9.5 years. So it takes about 9.5 years before households see actually any net savings. And for many low-income residents, that's not a timeline that they're willing to wait, especially if they need savings and just relief today. Something that's related to costs also is financial barriers. So interestingly, here in Vermont, there are many available options in terms of low interest, flexible. There are many options in terms of financing that are pretty flexible. VSECU has some really good loan options that offer zero or low rates or zero rates at all, and have very flexible timelines. And so they're just really good credit options here in the state. But just because there are these credit options does not mean that they're accessible for low-income residents. For example, low-income residents are more likely to have inadequate credit history. They might not have spotted credit history, or they might have defaulted at some point, or they just might not have the credit background to really be eligible for these loans. And so as a result, low to moderate income residents just might not be able to access these loans that are going to be really helpful in lowering costs. Another issue is just the risk of over leverage. A lot of low-income residents are concerned that just by taking on more loans and more credit, they're going to push themselves farther into debt and to inescapable debt. And also, if they take on a loan now and then there's an unforeseen cost in the future, they're concerned that they'll be too overexposed to pay off that unforeseen cost. And so a lot of the fear and the risk associated with financing is just too large to take on that type of debt. Something that's kind of similar to cost as well is the incentive structure. It's actually quite regressive. For example, the federal tax credit is great. It has been able to really subsidize solar panels for many homeowners, but it's truly only accessible for households and homeowners that make enough income that they have they have great enough taxable income for the credit to be worth anything. If I want to deduct $1,000 from my income tax, I need to owe the government $1,000 for that tax credit to actually be effective. And you can't go over that. So once I've hit zero on my tax liability, I can't get a refund from it because it's a non-refundable credit. According to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, this credit is actually 62% more effective for households that have an income above $75,000. And here in Bennington County, most of our towns, the median income is below $75,000, which means that this income tax credit is just not accessible or really that helpful for many of our residents. Another issue with the tax credit is also that it can't be claimed by nonprofits. So any organization that is working to support low-income residents or support low-income uptake of solar energy might not be able to access the credit. And so as a result, their solar panels are thus 26% more expensive, essentially. Similarly, the net metering system is also quite regressive. As the system has evolved over time and the rates have been changed and the adjusters have been added, the overall compensation from net metering has fallen. And so as a result of that, there are lower savings associated with it, and there's a longer payout period. And so as a result, just many residents are priced out because they aren't going to see the benefit they want to see. Another issue is that there's also no there's no like additional option for low-income residents. There isn't a separate rate for income qualifying residents that is just higher than the normal rate. And so since there's one rate for everyone, it isn't that effective for the people at the bottom. It's really more effective for people at the top. Moving on a little bit, something else I want to mention in terms of barriers is land conditions. Here in Vermont and in Bennington County, we're experiencing an aging housing stock. Over 40% of houses were in Bennington County were built before 1960, and over 30% were built before 1940. And so these houses likely need major renovation before they can have a solar panel installed. They might need their roofs to be redone or to maintain to make sure that they can support the system. They need to make sure that their electrical systems are up to code. And so these additional renovations take more time and take more money. And so because they require so much more, they will essentially price more residents out. And this is also disproportionately a low income problem because low income residents in Bennington County proportionally live in older and less well-maintained homes. This is for a variety of reasons. These houses tend to be less expensive. And also maybe there's potential for a history of redlining and zoning issues within Bennington County that have kind of pushed low-income residents to these areas. And so as a result of that, because low-income residents have these older houses, they might just have more renovations that they have to do before they can install solar panels, which then just adds too much cost to the entire project. Another major issue here is tenure status. Over a quarter of residents in Bennington County are renters, and renters are significantly restricted from accessing solar energy. And that's primarily because renters don't own their buildings, they have to defer to the landlords if they want to do any renovation. And this is where you run into the split incentive issue. And so what this is that the landlord is essentially responsible for the cost and the maintenance of the panels, but the actual savings will be given to the ratepayers, who are the tenants themselves. And so because the landlord doesn't see any of the savings associated with the cost and they're responsible for the cost, they are disincentivized from actually doing the project and will likely not do it. And because the tenants don't actually have any leverage over the landlord usually, they just are significantly restricted. So if the landlord doesn't want to do it, it's not going to happen. And then also, even if the landlord does agree and there are panels on the unit, there's some other issues that might happen. For many multifamily units, over a quarter of renters here in Bennington County don't actually have differentiated electricity costs. It is simply part of their utility bills. And so as a result, they might not know how much they're actually spending on electricity every year. And so even if electricity costs fall from a solar panel, the landlord can continue to charge the same utility rate and just take a profit off that. Another issue is the master metering system. So for many renting properties or just multifamily units, there isn't an individual electrical meter for every unit. There is just one for the entire building. And so as a result, it's impossible to know how many electricity every tenant is using and how to distribute net metering credits effectively. Another issue is just time and bureaucratic complexity. The people we're talking about here and that we're focusing on are people who are low income or who are living in poverty. And so they might have to work long hours or working multiple jobs. They're just trying to make sure that they have food on the table and that they're paying their rent and that their kids are in school and they have health insurance. And so they are really just trying to get along and make sure that the most immediate needs are taken care of. And so as a result, they might not have the time or the mental bandwidth to actually be able to take on such a large home renovation. And that's especially the case considering kind of the complexity that might go into a solar installation. Even though for residential systems, it's pretty straightforward, households might need to coordinate with an installer or a contractor or any person involved in the renovation process, or Green Mountain Power, who's the utility company here in Bennington County, or they have to deal with the Public Utilities Commission to make sure that they are allowed to put up a solar panel. And so because of all the steps and the coordination involved with a solar panel installation, you're asking for a lot of time out of people who want to get solar panels, and for low-income residents, they might not have the time or the energy to give to these projects. There are also just a couple issues that stem from the uncertainty that come from living in poverty. For example, there's the issue of income instability. Low-income households are not going to be willing to make a major investment in solar panels if they don't know if they're going to have a continued and consistent income to pay off those panels. There's also the issue of housing instability. Low-income residents are more than twice as likely to have moved in the last year. And so as a result, they might not want to make an investment in their house and renovation of their house if they won't see the payout until after they leave that house. There's also the issue of unforeseen costs, as I was talking about earlier. So if a household is paying off solar panels and then they have a car accident, or their car just breaks down, or they have a health emergency, or they have some unforeseen costs, they just might not have the accessible income available to pay off those costs. And so out of concern, out of that potential cost, they might not want to take on an investment like solar panels. So I've talked a lot about all of the barriers to traditional systems, and that low-income residents are just, for many reasons, unable to access a traditional residential solar installation. And so moving forward now, I'm going to talk a little about an alternative model that I think will be really helpful in making solar energy more accessible for low-income residents, and that model is community solar. And so in broad strokes, community solar or group net metering is when several ratepayers, so households, businesses, municipalities, nonprofits, commercial buildings, anyone who buys electricity, all gets their electricity and net metering credits from one singular large scale solar array. So an array between 150 and 500 kilowatts. And so today I'm going to be talking about two different models for solar energy. The first one is what I call the co-op of community owned model. And so how this works is that, again, a group of ratepayers, so households, businesses, municipalities, will all buy shares of a large solar array. So we'll all buy shares of this 150 kilowatt array. And so if I'm a household and I want to buy, and I need 2 kilowatts of capacity to offset my utility bills, I can buy shares of this larger project that is worth 2 kilowatts of energy. And then once the array is built, I will then get 2 kilowatts. I will then get the net metering credits from those 2 kilowatts that I own, essentially. And so how the financing works here usually is that, again, these shares, when you're buying into these projects, you're essentially paying for the part of the solar panel that you are buying. And so all of the shares are pulled together to finance the entire project. And so there are a couple really good benefits to these projects. First of all, on a per kilowatt basis, the price of buying in is actually significantly discounted than the price of a standalone system. This is for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you're buying a standalone system, there might be installation fees or just maintenance fees that you are solely responsible for. But here, by having several shareholders and by pooling everyone's resources that everyone shares together, you're essentially dividing up these excess costs amongst everyone, which then lowers the cost for everyone. There's also just economies of scale here, as opposed to a 5 kilowatt system. A 150 kilowatt system is a lot cheaper on a per kilowatt basis because it's bigger, and that's just how economies of scale functions. Another really good benefit of this is that it's accessible for people who are otherwise restricted from solar energy. So again, renters or people who have old houses or don't have enough land to build a solar array, these projects are accessible for them. And that's because in order to buy into a community solar array, you don't actually have to be on the same property or even near the property that hosts the array. You just need to be in the same service territory. And since everyone in Bennington County is a member of Green Mountain Power, that isn't really an issue. And so if I'm a renter, I can simply buy a share of an array that's somewhere else and then now have access to solar energy. And so it's much more accessible for these people who are traditionally excluded. Another benefit is that while these community solar arrays aren't necessarily geared towards low-income residents, they have the potential to be modeled and engineered so that they offer benefits for low-income residents as well. So either a discounted share-in rate or some of the energy being diverted specifically to low-income residents at a discounted or no charge. There are just ways for these community projects can be used to support low-income residents. Some of the challenges of these projects I'll get into a little bit include the bureaucratic complexity of these projects. We're dealing with a large-scale solar array, one that's much bigger than a residential system. And so because of that, the process of working through with the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, to get a permit for these projects is a lot more extensive. You might have to fill out environmental surveys and a lot of different permitting forms and just community surveys and a lot of different steps that go into this process that can take a lot of time and energy. And this is especially the case here because since there are so many different shareholders involved, since you have everyone who's buying into the project and everyone who's involved in developing the entire project, because you have to coordinate with all these individuals, it just adds a lot more complexity and burden to the project. And for these community-owned projects, if they are truly owned and operated by a local community, they might not have the administrative capacity to handle all this work. They might not be able to really take the time to work through all of these bureaucratic steps that are involved in the process. And so as a result of this, there's just added time that goes into these projects, and added time, there's just legal fees or administrative fees or just other different snafus that slow down the process and make it more burdensome and more expensive, and then can disincentivize this project. Another issue is upfront costs. Although they are significantly discounted than a standalone system, it is a pretty significant expenditure to buy into these systems. And so while more moderate income households might be able to afford the system. For the truly low income residents, the people who we're looking at in that bottom 20%, this might not necessarily be a project that is available to them. So one example I want to talk about today is the Acorn Community Solar Model. And so Acorn is a energy co-op up in Addison County, Vermont. And so as an energy co-op, it provides some really good benefits for its members. It offers low discounted fuel prices or discounted installation fees for certain energy efficiency measures. And one of the things that it offers is community solar projects. Acorn now has 3 projects in Addison County, with actually a 4th one just being announced. And so how this works is, so Acorn, excuse me, in collaboration with the town of Addison County, will identify a site for a solar array. And then once it's identified the site, it will draw up plans for a project and kind of just get the process moving. And then from there, it will seek financing from 2 types of investors. The first one is a Series A investor. And so this is a large, wealthy investor, so either a business or a wealthy investor. And so they are expected to front a lot of the cost of the solar array. And also the purpose of having them is so that you have an investor who has an adequate tax appetite to truly maximize the effect of the tax credit. And then once the Series A investor is found, the Acorn will then find a Series B investor. And so just a series of Series B investors. And so these are members of Acorn or residents of the town that they're working in, and they can just buy small shares of the project. In their most recent project in Bristol, Vermont, the shares came down to about $1.7 per watt, which is significantly discounted than that $2.98 for a standalone system. And then once all of the finance has been cleared out and they have enough shares bought in, Acorn will then handle all of the permitting and implementation and construction process. And then once the entire array is built, the net metering credits are then given to the shareholders. And so that's some really good benefits to this type of project. So again, this is an off-site net metering system, solar generation system, net metering. And so it's accessible to renters and to people who are land restricted. And it also offers net metering credits at a discounted original price. And so again, people who are traditionally priced out might have greater access to these types of projects. And also there's great savings over the 25, there's just great savings. In the Bristol project again, over the 25-year period of the actual project, Acorn is expecting that every shareholder will more than double their initial investment. Another great benefit to this is that Acorn does a lot of the work. They do all the permitting and the construction and the maintenance process. And so if I'm a shareholder, I can just buy into the project. And if I want to be hands-off uninvolved, I can let Acorn do all the work. And so it's a lot less work for me and it's a lot easier to get involved. But conversely, because it is a co-op model, there also is a democratic system involved. So if you buy a share or you're a member of the co-op, you do have a say in the whole process if you want. You can be involved in the siting and the permitting and just how the entire procedure is set up. And that is a really good way to avoid some environmental injustices that we see with community solar. Moving on a little bit, so some of the challenges actually faced with Acorn is, again, while the price is lower on a per watt basis, it is still a significant upfront cost. For 2 kilowatts, again, you're looking for a single kilowatt, you're looking at over $1,500, excuse me. And so again, for truly low-income residents, this again might not be a accessible cost for them. Another issue is this limited capacity. Acorn is, again, a volunteer community-based organization. It is run and operated by mostly volunteers. I believe there's 1 part-time staff member. And so as a result of that, it doesn't really have the capacity to deal with a lot of the bureaucratic steps that are required for community solar array, and might not have the time or the effort or the expertise to effectively and quickly move through it. And so Acorn is faced with a lot of just bureaucratic burden, and it takes a long time for these projects to get off the ground, and then they have to face some higher costs again. I know in Shoreham, Vermont, during their second project, actually, it took about 6 years for the entire project to work because of a series of issues in the bureaucratic sphere. So again, Acorn just, because it is a community-based organization, just struggles to get its project off the ground because it's limited capacity. Another model I want to talk about in the co-op model is the Hartford Public Safety Project. And I want to talk about this project for 2 reasons. First of all, this is an example in which a community solar array was diverted to help low-income residents specifically. And it's also a great example of a town being the driver of a community solar project. And so what happened here is that Hartford, Vermont, in collaboration with Norwich Solar Technologies, which is one of the largest installers in the state, they identified that the roof of the Hartford Police and Fire building would be a great place to host an array. And so together they built an 87 kilowatt solar array on the roof of the building. And then from there, the credits were distributed amongst the different shareholders. So Hartford itself was a shareholder. There was an independent impact investor, And then some of the credits were also diverted to two low-income housing communities, one owned by Twin Pines Housing, the other one by Stewart Property Management. And then these net metering credits were then used to lower the cost for the residents of these low-income communities, and just to make the electricity and their living expenses a bit more manageable. So that's the project in the broad strokes. And so some of the benefits of this project, again, is that this is a way in which a community solar project can be used and co-opted to support low-income residents. Here, the net metering credits were specifically diverted to the residents of these affordable housing developments at discounted rates, so that they can have access and still be a part of solar energy and get the benefits of solar energy without having to pay these massive upfront costs. Another really cool benefit of this is that it's a great example of a town stepping in and doing a lot of the work. I think that towns are uniquely leveraged to be a driver in a lot of community solar projects. They have a lot of municipal land and municipal resources, and have greater capacity than just greater administrative capacity than just a community-based project. And so this is a great example of a town using a lot of the resources that it has in order to drive a project. Some of the challenges involved with this project, one thing is that it did require an outside investor. And as I'll get to in a little bit, there are some questions about the sustainability of that type of funding source. Another issue here is that, as I was saying, Hartford was willing and able to take on a lot of the burden, but that might not necessarily be true for all towns throughout Vermont. Here in Bennington County, a lot of our towns are incredibly small and have little municipal or administrative capacity. And so it might be a lot for us to ask of really small towns to take on so much work and so much burden. So it really is dependent on which town we're working with. So moving on a little bit, the second model I want to talk about today is the subscription or the third-party leasing model. And so how this model works is that there is a large solar array again, and it is owned by an independent entity. So whether or not that is an investor or a wealthy individual or a solar developer or group investors or whoever, they own this panel. And then from there, they will then lease out parts of the panel to interested subscribers at a discounted rate. And so once the leasing agreement has been agreed to, once the agreement has been signed and delivered, and the subscribers now are leasing out the panels, they then will get the net metering credits from the panel, and then they pay the owners of the panel a subscription fee, a flat subscription rate. And so how the financing of this works is that, again, the panel owners front all the upfront costs. They implement and they build and maintain the entire project, and then the subscribers pay a fee to those owners. And so the owners recoup their loss through the subscription fees, and the subscribers just get net metering credits. And so some of the benefits of this is that for subscribers, there are no upfront costs. Again, that is all covered by the panel owners. And so for truly low-income residents who don't have the ability to pay high upfront costs, this is a really good option for them because they only have to pay the subscription fee. And usually, not always though, not necessarily, how it works is that the subscription fee is less than the net metering credits that's going to be available. And so there is immediate savings. There isn't any added cost for signing on, essentially. Another benefit, again, is that like the co-op model, it's offsite generation. You don't have to be near or on the same property as the panels. So renters or people who are land restricted can still buy into these projects. And another great benefit to this, as I was saying earlier, is that the savings are immediate, as opposed to a co-op model where you have to wait for the panels to pay themselves off. Because you're not paying the upfront costs, you're only getting the benefit of the net metering credits, you will see immediate savings. Some of the challenges, however, to this project is that while the savings are immediate, in the long run, it is less than in a co-op model. Because again, the savings are derived from the difference between the net metering credits and the subscription model. So what is ever left between those two costs is what you save. According to Norwich Solar Technology, that has its own subscription program, subscribers save about 5 to 10% of the utility bill, which is still a significant reduction in cost, but not as much as offsetting your entire utility bill. And so although you see savings immediately over the lifetime of a solar panel, if you own those panels, you will get more savings than if you just lease them. Another issue with this type of project is being dependent on an angel investor, so an outside impact investor who is willing to shoulder the costs and shoulder the administrative burden and take on the risk of working with low-income residents. And there's some issues about whether or not this is a reliable and sustainable funding source. It's unclear if we want to scale up these types of projects, if those type of funding sources will always be there, as opposed to in a community co-op model where the buy-in is coming from inside the community. So that's a bit more stable and a bit more grounded. So the example I want to talk about today is the Star Lake Lane Community Solar Project. And so Star Lake Lane is a low-income housing development in Norwich, Vermont. And so here, Norwich Solar Technologies, in collaboration with an impact investor and Star Lake Lane, built three 15 kilowatt arrays on Star Lake Lane property. And then from there, the net metering credits were then given to the residents of Starlight Lane at a discounted rate. And so overall, these residents saved on average about $251 a year. And this is a pretty significant discount. Yeah, so again, some of the benefits here. This is off-site solar generation. And so again, renters and land restricted individuals can get involved. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there are no upfront costs to the subscribers. It's all on that impact investor. And so the low-income residents of Starlight Lane saw savings immediately. And also another benefit of this is that all the logistical elements were handled by Norwich Solar Technologies and the impact investor rather than a community itself. And so because Norwich has the technical expertise and just the background of this, they are able to have a better handle on it. And something that's actually specific to this case study specifically, and I think it's really interesting, is that there's actually an agreement between the panel owner and the low-income community that once the panels have paid themselves off, that the ownership will be transferred to the community itself and then turn into a co-op model, which I think is honestly something that I think that should be scaled up more often. Some of the challenges of these projects is, again, you do need that third party impact investor who, while we have it here, we're not quite sure if that's a very sustainable funding source. And again, although they're saving $251 a year, which is pretty significant, in the long run, it is not going to be as great of a saving as if they own the panels themselves. And also, it's important to note that while this kind of ownership switch is really great and effective, it's not typical for these types of agreements. Here's some other really interesting examples. I'm not going to go into them, but if you want to after this presentation, there's a great list of co-op models and subscription models and some projects that are here in Bennington County that I think are worth exploring. So finally today, I wanted to take everyone through a couple different ways that I think we can improve the process and to make these community solar projects more viable and to better scale them up. First of all, I think we need to increase coordination amongst stakeholders to share financial administrative burden. As I've talked about throughout the entire presentation, the major impediments to community solar projects are the cost and the administrative burdens. They're just really expensive and a massive hassle to do, especially if you don't have a lot of the capacity to handle these issues. But as we've been seeing through the case studies, some entities have greater capacity to handle different issues more than others. Installers know a lot more about the bureaucratic elements and the technical elements of a community solar project, for example, or RPCs are uniquely positioned to know a lot of people to get involved. And so if we encourage all these different stakeholders, so towns, businesses, installers, nonprofits, RPCs, to work together on solar projects and to leverage all of their different social positions and their different expertise, we can really make these projects more effective and faster and just more successful. For example, like I said, solar installers can offer their knowledge, their know-how to these projects. Towns are another great example. As I talked about with Hartford, towns are uniquely positioned because they know the local landscape very well. Towns have the ability to identify preferred sites in their jurisdiction, which can then help improve the regulatory outcome of the project. They also can inquire with solar installers to use municipal land as a potential place to host an array, and so they are uniquely positioned to get things moving. RPCs, we by definition know a lot of different entities in the area and know a lot of different actors within this field, and so we have the ability to facilitate a lot of the interactions that are required. So hosting forums or incubators or just other different settings in which towns, installers, and nonprofits and other entities can come together and work on these projects is something RPCs are uniquely positioned to do. It's also important to recognize that when we're talking about increasing coordination to make sure that low-income interests are also represented during this time. So what this looks like very concretely is working with towns and working with nonprofits that work with low-income residents. So local food banks or GBICs, which is the interfaith group here in Bennington County, or working with housing authorities, people who are on the ground with low-income communities to help develop resources and new models for them to better participate. Because these groups are uniquely positioned to inform us about how we can better incorporate low-income interests into these projects. There's also something to be said about reaching out to improving our own outreach and reaching out directly to low-income residents and low-income communities and make sure that they are informed about these projects. Something else I think we need to focus on separately is developing shared resources to streamline and simplify the process. As I've been talking about, there's this great administrative burden and a lot of different things that go into these projects. And so if we can do anything to help check things off the list, we can really help get these projects off the ground and move a lot faster. For example, having a sample RFP for towns to fill out and send to installers is a great way for them just to get things moving. Or just having sample project plans or proposals, or offering videos about how the regulatory process works, or just having information about shared insight can be a great way of helping people know where to start and just help get the ball rolling for them. It's also important to make sure that we have up-to-date and accessible data and information about solar energy. A lot of the work that I've done over the past 6 weeks has just been compiling information about solar energy within the county. It's pretty scattered at the moment. And so making sure that we've consolidated all this information can be really helpful. So having up-to-date and accessible information about regional capacity, how much solar energy we actually have in the county, or having consistent and consolidated and centralized data about current net metering rates and the pricing and the cost and the savings associated with solar panels can be really helpful. Or just having very clear information about preferred siting and what is currently a preferred site, how we can make things preferred site can be really helpful. And that can be really beneficial for projects and for interesting parties who want to get things moving, so that they can kind of have all the information at the ready for them, and just know the landscape very well so they can get moving with their project. I also think it's really helpful if we make sure that we have a consolidated list or just a database or a centralized place to talk about who is interested, who are the different actors involved, and who you can go to for help. That can really help move things along and increase collaboration. Separately, I think we also need to make sure that we're increasing our outreach to low and moderate income communities. Our programs and the whole focus of this work has been to make sure that we're supporting these communities, but we need to make sure that they know about the programs that we're doing and are interested in them. And so this includes working with towns and again, these organizations that work with low-income communities to help distribute materials and information that are specifically targeted towards them, and tell them and offer comprehensive and complete and accessible information about the energy options that they have and the financing options they have. So offering data and information about how community solar works and what are the costs associated with it, and what are the different options and what are the savings associated with it. Just making sure that we are being clear and transparent and very helpful so we can better inform these communities. Also involves connecting them with other energy efficiency programs in the area. Just because solar energy might not be the one for a certain household does not mean that they shouldn't look into other options. So referring them to weatherization projects or different weatherization entities, or referring them to Green Saving Smart, which is the new program out of Brock that helps to offer financial literacy for households or teach them about the different energy efficiency options. So just like giving them a very well-rounded understanding of the options available to them. All the while, it's important to make sure that we are using grassroots and community-based methods. Throughout my time here at the BCRC, I've heard a lot about how a lot of our programs fail or are slow to be implemented because people are very cynical of the government or outside entities coming in and telling them what they need to do or what's going to be helpful or how to do things. There's just this general disdain for government elitism. And so if we want to make sure that our programs and our policies and our plans are working and are effective, we need to make sure that we are actually reaching out to these communities and being a part of these communities and listening to these communities. This involves just tabling or making presentations at large gatherings, working with community leaders to kind of hear what they think the community needs, and kind of getting their endorsement and their support, or doing neighborhood demonstrations. So if my neighbor has solar panels on his roof and he's willing to tell me about how it works and what are the savings associated with it, that's a lot more effective than some random person in the BCRC coming to my house and telling me what solar panels are and that I need them. So making sure that we are really utilizing the networks that are in place right now and being a part of these communities rather than kind of forcing anything onto them. And finally, I also want to talk about some regulatory reform. I'm very aware that we're not going to fix any regulatory issues today, but I think it's important to notice some of them. First and foremost, there needs to be action taken to reform the incentive structure to make it more progressive. At the state or the federal level, there should be a more direct incentive rather than a tax credit. This will just be more accessible for low-income residents and will be more beneficial for them in financing solar energy. Additionally, the PUC should work to change its net metering policies, whether that is returning to old base rates that are higher and more progressive, or changing the siting adjusters, or creating a separate program altogether for low-income residents. So offering an additional rate for income qualifying residents so that they get an additional boost for the energy that they're producing is all great ways to make sure that the system is favoring low-income residents. Finally, I think it's important to talk about working with the PUC and the state legislature to streamline the permitting process. As we're talking about, these programs and these projects get bogged down in bureaucratic, just like messes essentially, and it's a very messy process. And so working with these entities to streamline the process and to make them easier and simpler and faster is a great way to incentivize these projects. So finally today, I just want to talk about why we're talking about this all again. And that's because, as you can see here, as the numbers and the data and the graphs are showing us, a lot of our current incentive systems that are meant to help scale up solar energy are really only helping a small portion of people in Bennington County, and that those individuals are the people on the higher end of the income scale. So if we really want to be helping low-income residents in our county, we have to make sure that our systems and our projects and our models are better suited to help them, and rather than just this top 20%. Thank you. Any questions? Stop sharing.
We had something in the chat from Laurel asking, is there a map somewhere showing where all the community solar projects are in the state? That's a good question. Did you come across anything like that?
That is a good question. I actually was unable to find anything of just like where the community solar projects around the state are. I know that Green Mountain Power has a very comprehensive map of where all just the solar installations are around the state, which is like, it's just like a map of Vermont. And then if you click on like little dots around the map, you can see like what the capacity is for that project. So there isn't really a way to differentiate between like a residential solar array and a large scale project. But in terms of maps, that's really the one I've seen so far, but I think it is a pretty helpful one, just seeing what capacity looks like statewide.
Josh, Jim Hand, there is on VCAN. If you
there's on VCAN.
Go to VCAN and there is a map. I can't tell you that they specifically identify community versus someone's residential one. But all the sites are listed at each town, and they can also tell you the sizes of them.
That's great. I also know that VCAN has a lot of resources, and they have a community solar toolbox, and so that's also a really good resource to look into.
Right.
Other questions for Josh?
Well, it's not a question for Josh, but I mean, I'm glad he's bringing this subject up. I don't know what the answer or answers are. I went through a discussion yesterday or the day before with a group that I'm involved with. In the complaint by one of the utilities, GMP, is that giving these high credits for kilowatt hours is causing them lots of heartburn and loss, if you will. And they're claiming that, that everybody else is paying, the difference in higher rates. In an analysis done by Rev and a couple of other folks, it's amounting to about 1 to maybe 1.5% of their total income stream. So quite honestly, I think that's probably a false narrative that they keep using, and the legislators respond to this. So it's no surprise that they keep chipping away at the return on a credit or a kilowatt hour. And they keep sort of disincentivizing the whole solar industry, quite frankly.
Definitely. And I think it's interesting because, as you've been saying, they've been kind of lowering the rates because they're concerned about shifting the cost onto non-participating ratepayers. But there's an element of, I mean, disproportionately, the not participating ratepayers are low-income residents. But to me, the solution isn't to cut net metering for everyone. Now that a lot of people have solar energy, the solution is to make the net metering system more inclusive, so that low-income residents can also participate in this process. And also, I know GMP, like the PUC mentioned how much it was going to cost over the next 25 years. I think they said it was about $44 million for the next 25 years. But it's over their entire budget. That's as I've been told, it's not a very significant source of their budget. So the argument is that
they have pulled back on that number.
Okay, good.
Yeah, but you're heading in the right direction there. But yeah, that's the response and the answer that they use constantly with the PUC. I mean, the other thing is part of the problem, and I don't know if we're able to get there, is we don't put any value on the carbon that we're offsetting. I understand we want to encourage more folks at the lower incomes to, to take advantage of solar and be part of the process. But those, at least that who are helping, I will say maybe indirectly, although climate change is existing. For every, kilowatt that we produce cleanly, so to speak, reduces, carbon input. Now, that's an indirect benefit, and it doesn't affect their wallet. I get that, but there is still benefit. So this idea of continuing to tamp down the solar industry in general is not the way to go.
Yeah, definitely. And I think to that point, honestly, sorry, I keep bringing interesting points. That something that I didn't really talk about very much, but is slightly in the slide about net metering credits and what the current rates look like. There's the REC adjuster, which is the renewable energy credit, and so renewable energy credits are just the credit associated with consuming renewable energy. And in the current structure of the net metering system, the current system is almost like devaluing those credits themselves, because I know if residents choose to sell those net metering those RECs to the utilities, they get zero. Actually, they're worth 0 per kilowatt hour if they sell them to the utilities, and they're -4 cents if you decide to keep them. And so it's almost like devaluing and undervaluing the credits associated with renewable energy.
Yeah, good point.
Well, unless anyone else has any other questions, we can wrap up. So Josh will be doing another presentation next week, next Thursday at 3:30 on Zoom, about his research on weatherization and low income access to weatherization and energy efficiency services, that sort of thing. So please tune into that if you're interested. Also, this recording of this and also Josh's presentation will be posted onto the BCRC website so that other people can watch it and it can be shared. So
I just wanted to say,
Yep.
I had the pleasure of talking with Josh, and I want to congratulate him on, it was really a well-done presentation with a lot of detail that he had to wade through and research. So he did a very good job. So
Thank you.
Yeah, you'd think
that.
you'd be like studying this. You've been studying this for like months or years, and you've only been here 6 weeks.
Thank you.
It's just crazy.
It's been fascinating work.
it's good stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
And yes, Laura, I can send the link. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, everyone.